For today's history video, I want to continue to discuss the best and the worst presidential transitions in history as we watch history unfolding in front of our eyes. You know, Obama's transition to Trump. God, that feels so good to say. The personally most bitter relationship between two presidents that in history was the 1952-53 transition of power from Harry Truman to Dwight D. Eisenhower. Truman and Eisenhower should have been the most smooth transition. There was one point when they really liked each other. Truman persuaded Eisenhower, who had gone to become president of Columbia University after his World War II service, to come back into service and become the commander of NATO, the newly formed organization that protected Europe. And there was even some speculation in 1948 that Truman would withdraw from the race for re-election, which nobody thought he could win, and that Eisenhower would run in his stead. Back then it wasn't known if Eisenhower was Democrat or Republican, and people thought he might run as a Democrat and replace Truman, and Truman was cool with that. Eventually it didn't happen. So in 1952, when Eisenhower was the Republican nominee, and Truman was in the White House supporting Adlai Stevenson, the Democratic candidate, the election campaign began and nobody expected a tremendously bitter outcome. Then Joseph McCarthy, the senator from Wisconsin, McCarthyism was named after him, who was outrageous and vicious in his conduct, in his attacks, his partisanship, leaked to the press that he had derogatory information about the Democratic candidate, Adlai Stevenson. And in fact, what it was an accusation that Stevenson was gay. Back then, being gay was an immediate disqualification for anything, much less the presidency. Stevenson was married and had been married and divorced. And when Truman heard Truman was supporting Stevenson, that McCarthy had threatened that, he sent a message to Eisenhower, the Republican nominee, to repudiate that and to tell McCarthy not to proceed with this. And when Eisenhower didn't take any action, Truman got very upset and very angry at Eisenhower and privately threatened to release a letter that Eisenhower had sent to Marshall, the head of the Army, in 1946. This letter was a very compromising letter. Eisenhower had been the commander in Europe during the entire war, and he left Mamie, his wife, and their family behind in the United States. And while he was in Britain, he struck up a love affair with Kay Summersby, a British military person who was charged with driving him around. And Kay and Eisenhower became very intimate, and the extent of their relationship was revealed in two books that Summersby wrote, both very deferential and positive to Eisenhower. And it was true love. Eisenhower then wrote Marshall a letter saying that he wanted to bring Summersby back to the United States. He wanted her to be admitted to America, to be made a citizen, to be transferred into the American Army where she could serve, and that they wanted to be married, and he wanted to divorce Mamie. George Marshall, the chief of staff, had been Eisenhower's mentor. Ike was his protege, and Eisenhower kind of followed in Marshall's wake and was in awe of Marshall. Marshall was a very straight-laced, puritanical guy with very clear convictions of right and wrong, and he exploded when he read Eisenhower's letter. And he wrote back to Eisenhower saying that if you do this, I personally will drum you out of the Army and make sure you are dishonorably discharged and your career is ruined. And Eisenhower was thoroughly cowed. He backed down. He abandoned his relationship with Summersby. He moved back to the United States, back in with Mamie, and they remained married until his death in the early 1960s. But that letter remained in the file, and Truman's threat to reveal that letter was tantamount to assassinating Eisenhower. And Eisenhower took it very personally. And as a result, the relationship between the two men was totally destroyed. But the letter remained out there as an issue. Nobody knew about it. This never appeared in the press. It was only revealed in the 1970s in some of the Eisenhower biographies. But it soured the relationships between the two of them. They didn't speak to each other on Inauguration Day, and they never spoke to each other again during the 1950s. In the early 60s, there was a little bit of a rapprochement before each man died, but not much of it. Now, the irony is that Eisenhower died not knowing that Truman had destroyed the letter. After he threatened to use it, and then did not, he destroyed the letter. But Eisenhower never knew that, and the relationships between the men were permanently screwed up. Thanks for watching.